letters I'd like to read from friends of the library. The first one is from U.S. Senator Jeanne Shaheen, and it reads, "Dear friends, I join you all in spirit for this evening's River Reads, Exeter Reads John Lewis's event. Thank you to the Exeter Library staff and Russ Dean for organizing and moderating this event. And of course, thank you to everyone here tonight for diving into the text and bringing your thoughts and perspectives to this important community conversation. I have always believed that a community library should be more than a simple building with rows of books. Rather, it should be a door to new opportunities for information, education, and recreation. A library's offering of books, multimedia, technology, meeting spaces, and local events can connect even the smallest of towns to a much larger world of discovery and community conversation. This is certainly the case with the River Reads program at Exeter Public Library, and this evening's discussion shines a light on the life of John Lewis and invites reflection on the causes for which he fought so forcefully for over 60 years. Knowing John Lewis's story is important when we consider the progress we have made and the work that remains in fulfilling America's highest ideals. His powerful words in his final message to the nation should inspire us to continue to march forward on the path of justice and equality. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. Walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. I wish you all the best as you continue your good work. Sincerely, Jeanne Shaheen, United States Senator." A second letter, dated April 29, 2022. "Dear friends, I regret that I cannot be with you today, but I join you in celebrating the life and legacy of Representative John Lewis and in renewing our commitment to the work to which he dedicated his life. It has been nearly 2 years since our country has lost the man known as the conscience of the Congress. We have a responsibility to carry on his fight for equality, freedom, and justice for all. Congressman Lewis's spirit lives on in gatherings like this one, where community members can gather and draw on his unwavering optimism for the better future that we can build together. Thank you to the Exeter Public Library for organizing this event and to everyone who made this discussion possible. I look forward to continuing to work with Granite Staters to carry on John Lewis's legacy of good trouble. With every good wish, Maggie Hassan, United States Senator." So, and with that, we will kick off the discussion about this very great book. His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. Hopefully you've had a chance to read it. It's by John Meacham, who's a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and anybody who's researched John's background knows that he's very well in tune with presidential level, writing about presidential level politics and biographies of recent or not so recent holders of that office. So John's a great author, and I know we're going to get into some of the discussion here about what he has done with this great book. So, with that in mind, I'll pull out my questions, and this is a good group, so we're going to get right to it here. The first is, why call this book "His Truth is Marching On," and what is the significance of this American spiritual song to the civil rights movement and John Lewis specifically? And the other question within this question is, were you familiar with the song's lyrics prior to reading the book? So it's a great question. So who wants to start? I'm eager to pass this microphone off, so don't all raise your hands at once. I see Nancy in the back. I know she wants to answer. Yeah. Yeah, and I'll say, I mean, when I read the book and the question came up about the lyrics to his Truth is Marching On, or the Battle Hymn of the Republic, you know, I have to say I wasn't overly familiar with the lyrics of that song, so I actually went into my song archives and brought up a couple of author or performers of the song. One was Judy Garland, who did it live in the 60s. and it was quite a version that I was able to find on my iTunes. And then the other version was from the U.S. Army band, and it was very good. So one of the things that I would say about this particular song and how it related to the book was, I know so much of what John Lewis did was religion-based and based in his faith, right? And so the lyrics to the song, and I have to say I wasn't as familiar as I should have been with the lyrics of the song. The lyrics talk about freedom, and they talk about letting men die for the concept of freedom. And that was something that I definitely picked out from the lyrics. And, you know, his truth is marching on. There's so many things that you can draw from that. His meaning God. Truth is marching on, the march, right, from Selma to Montgomery, and all of those details that went with that. So that's what I got out of it. So, but I'd be interested to hear anybody else's opinion and people that want to talk about that. Good, we have a willing taker.
Thank you. On page 109 is where it begins the reference to, and this was a song that they actually sang at a pivotal point in the civil rights movement. I was familiar with the words to this song from my years as a Sunday school teacher and churchgoer. So yeah, it's very meaningful in that context that the people who were about to be trapped in the church were singing this song. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Mm-hmm. Pam will add to that, or yeah, we have others. That's good. We love our microphones here.
Just as an aside,
John Brown's body, yes. Mm-hmm.
I also referred to the song on page 109, and I do remember from Sunday school learning the song, as well as in school. Back then we did sing songs in school, and referring to God as His truth is marching on. On page 110, the second verse says, as He died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. His truth is marching on. So I believe that calling the book His Truth is Marching On comes specifically from the song, but we can break down every word in that title. His refers to God and God's truth. Truth is what is right and just. The word is currently happening, not what was or will be, but what is currently happening. Marching, putting one foot in front of the other, one step at a time to get to where you need to be. And the word on, continuing forward. I also think that it was chosen because they knew that they were going into, quote, battle. When you go into battle, it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to fight back physically. They knew that they would be battled against, but they continued to show God's grace through peace and love, and you can battle with that as well.
Others, any other thoughts? And if you want to state your name before you do your thing.
I'm Nancy, and I'm familiar with the song from school, which I think is very interesting because I went to Sunday schools too, and we didn't sing that in Sunday school, we sang it in school. And I guess for a contemporary comment, I just read that the League of Women Voters has New Hampshire on its hit list because on the state level we've passed some restrictive voting laws, you know, and here we have a group here, you know, it's ironic to me that there are people who are open-minded and trying to be educated and learn the facts, and you know, people on the other side that just are going against the work all the work that he's done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone feel like the truth, in terms of how it's been stated, his truth is marching on? Does anyone feel like the author wanted to send a message about what truth is? And in the context of the overall book that he wrote about John Lewis and his actions and what was real based upon all the different events, that's sort of caught me as one of those things that may be part of the title. His truth is marching on, meaning we're not done yet. Like this is the truth, and this is what's in this book, and therefore, you know, we must carry on the legacy of what was done in the 1963, 1964, 5 era, and continue with that. And maybe this is a sort of a second cycle of that happening in certain ways with people's views on the Voting Rights Act. I mean, I can tell you up until, what was it, 4 years ago? I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, nobody really mentioned the Voting Rights Act very, very much. And now it's very much at the forefront of what we're dealing with in today's political landscape. So that, I know for me, that was part of I thought part of the title was the truth is the Voting Rights Act, and what the truth also is what went on in that era to affirm and put down markers about how our modern society would vote and what the right to vote meant. So that's the moderator's comment. Mr. Campbell.
Bill Campbell. On 131, Meacham says, the South of the 60s was born in the 1960s, was born in the 1860s, which follows on what you're saying, because now I think where we are now is born in the 1960s. I mean, I think it just, as you were saying, continues on with the same kind of, I think, a little different tactics, but we still have problems that the 1960 dealt with from the 1860s, and now we're still dealing with the Voting Act of the 60s and other acts in that time. So I think right now, I mean, that's why I felt this book was quite relevant to where we are and what we're going through.
Thank you. Other input?
My thinking was that obviously music is a very important part of religious ceremonies for both Dr. King, for John Lewis. And what came out of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, I think, is the real anthem for the civil rights movement, which was "We shall not, we shall overcome." And that became sort of ubiquitous in American culture in the 60s. That was, in my opinion, the real anthem from the civil rights movement of the 60s.
Thank you. Yep, another comment?
My name's Sally. Okay.
Hi, Sally.
I'm a retired teacher, so I have a teacher.
Oh, excellent.
Just to piggyback on what you said about the title as well, I mean, marching does imply soldiers, and many of the workers in the civil rights movements were referred to as foot soldiers. They considered themselves foot soldiers, even those who are living today. That's their label, so I think that's kind of part of that connection as well.
Another comment?
I can also just speak without a mic. I think, to me, the key word is truth. And how we validate truth is what is an awful lot of what's going on now. Truth is supposed to march on,
So fast fact, I was born in 1969, so I was born 5 or 6 years after all of this took place. So I know there are people in this room that lived through it, and have something to offer as far as that goes. So like every moment in history, if you don't live through it, you can only see it through a certain lens, right? If you live through it, you have a perspective from that. So it would be great to hear from other people. You know, I'll give you the best I can from the moderator's seat, but for people that were there and lived through this, it's great to hear your perspective on it. So thank you. Yep, another comment here. This is great. We're off to a running start here. This is awesome.
Just for historical context, I was in college at the time, but I did my student teaching in Cleveland, and I had an all-black class. And Martin Luther King was assassinated while I was in Cleveland. And Carl Stokes, the mayor, who was black, kept the lid on everything. But it was interesting. We had off from school. So I got on a bus fearlessly and rode around town and watched the people kind of swarm. And, I was stupid and naive, but, there was anger in the streets for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We're still on question 1. We're going to be here for a while tonight, and that's okay.
I was long out of college by the time the civil rights movement was going on, and remember John Lewis's arrest. And what I think is particularly strong in the title is the marching on, his persistence. He came back to this, and he was optimistic every time he was set back, every time there was a stop. There was an attempt to put an end to whatever civil rights action was going on in the voting rights summers. He was persistent, and that's what I like about the title, above all of the other good things that have been said.
Mark, you're up.
Thank you. Not to belabor, this might tie into the 7th question.
Thank you. Good comments. So looking at the second question, each chapter is introduced with 2 quotes, often of opposing viewpoints. And the question is, why does Meacham choose to frame his chapters in such a way? What do the 2-page photo spreads at the beginning of each chapter do to prepare us for the content within? So that's a good question. From a guy who was born in 1969, my response is that they basically put you in a place and time. And I think the pictures are very powerful and augment what the narrative says. And I think, my own opinion is just that the author wanted to reinforce the message that he was trying to convey through the chapters about the seriousness of the Civil Rights Act and the Freedom Rides and the different pieces of the puzzle that fit into those 5 or 6 years. So, but I'd welcome other comments on that. They really jump off the page for a person that didn't live through it. It's a great narrative through that era.
Realize the reality words on the really say.
Yeah, I'd love to hear others' responses to the visuals and just what was in the book to see if you thought they captured it the right way and whether it was, I mean, for me, they were all very powerful, all the different shots at the show in the book. And I'm interested in hearing people's views too on and I don't know if this will come up in the questions later on, but the whole nonviolence approach to dealing with the issues that they were dealing with struck me as kind of amazing. I mean, it was pretty amazing that there was a setup that basically said, look, no matter what happens to us, we're going to address it in a nonviolent way. We're not going to fight back. Our message is the fight. I thought that was very captivating toward how John Lewis in particular approached with the SNCC group, their approach to the situation. So anybody who was present during that time want to weigh in on that one? Maybe I asked my own question. I probably shouldn't have done that.
It was based on his love, right? It was all about not love.
Mm-hmm.
But it was to love other people, and you can't show them love by being violent back to them. They were setting an example, trying to make a change.
I think it also emphasizes the fact that you violence with violence will only escalate. And to have the courage to be nonviolent calls for a great deal more inner strength.
And that was an open debate, and that was very clear in the book, the way the book described the dynamics of what was going on, right? Michael?
Well, I think it's also a matter of practicality. There was no way that that African Americans, then known as Negroes, were ever going to beat the system that was in place. Look what happened at the Pettus Bridge, for example. Mm-hmm. They beat them by being persistent. They didn't beat them because they had overwhelming power and authority. And I think that's where Dr. King comes in, because he tried to make that point with people. You can, in fact, and that was the birth of the Black Panther Party. It was Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown had a very different view on how this should be done, because it's anti-American not to be aggressive.
Thanks. Good points.
Following up on that, I was struck by the part of the text where Lewis lost the leadership role to Stokely Carmichael after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I thought the point was being made in the text that the fight was different because now they were fighting for equality against sort of entrenched systems of racism. And the point was made there's no really effective way to be nonviolent against a form of oppression that's just sort of been built into the fabric of society for 100 years. If you're silent, you're complicit. And so it did seem to me that the book was in part an exploration of the limits of nonviolence as a form. I mean, and trying to map it onto what's happening today, I don't see how, I mean, violence is not being offered, outright violence is not being offered today. It's all misinformation and sort of propaganda. We're sort of this war of ideologies, and I'm not sure how an explicit philosophy of nonviolence approaches problems like that. I mean, it may not be the best. I mean, not that I advocate violence against propaganda, but it's a different arena somehow. It seems not to apply exactly. The fit is wrong. So it's not necessarily the best choice for every fight. It's marvelous what they accomplished with it, but they were being offered violence, and so they could make a very clear and distinct choice to respond to it with the antithesis of what they were being given. The match is not as good now.
Thank you.
I would just like to understand, are you talking about physical violence versus violence through words? Or social media, or?
Well, I think, the early chapters of the book is definitely physical violence, and Lewis making the decision, when I am struck, I'm not going to strike. Talk about other forms of violence is for this concern. I'm very much caught up in the question of how do we fight against what we face now? How to draw lessons from the book. I'm a little befuddled about exactly what those lessons might be.
So, in the book, at least to this reader, things were sort of laid out in clearer ways, right? You had Supreme Court decisions, you had things that were supposed to be upheld but weren't, and then you had the Civil Rights Act, you had the Voting Rights Act, and even then it was still a struggle, right? So there were things sort of put on the books that basically instructed what should take place next. And that struggle was, in a lot of instances, against what was already on the books as law and as the law of the land and what should happen. But there were still issues with implementation. At least that's what I got out of it, and gave rise to this movement, which became something large. It already had a large constituency outside the South, but then became bigger as things gave root to these groups, to the groups that formed in order to make sure that implementation happened. So relating that back to today, I don't know if it's easier or harder to sort of make those distinctions today and know exactly what's being fought for. And I shouldn't say that. We know what's being fought for, but how to go about it and the roadmap, basically, in that regard. So now I'm causing a lot more questions, and we're never going to get through the questions, but that's what I'm here for. So if you raise your hand, you get to talk. That's the way it is today.
Should I look at the questions and see if what I'm going to say comes in any of the other questions? I guess I'm really struggling with, or thinking a lot about the same question that Lisa is. And so it's really clear to me that, like, when there was the white supremacy rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, Like, it was really clear to the local clergy in the area and to others that they needed to train in nonviolence. They knew it was happening beforehand and they had time to train, and then that worked. And I think it was especially important because they were confronting people with powerful guns, and so it really would have escalated fast, you know. And of course, Heather Heyer was lost on that day, so there was violence, but it's really clear in that case. And now I'm trying to think about the propaganda question, and I'm coming back to the first question about truth, you know, and just thinking what I've been seeing a lot lately are people finding really powerful ways to continue to tell truth again and again. And so, like, the National Memorial of Peace and Justice in Montgomery is this incredible place, and it attempts to tell the truth of every lynching that happened on this soil in this country. And it is making sure that that violence can't be erased or papered over or forgotten. And then I'm seeing also, like, other memorials being planned and erected in Montgomery that are speaking to truths that have not been spoken in the same way. And so it's like you can't I'm seeing that maybe necessarily you can't overcome all propaganda or misinformation, but you can keep telling the truth, like, from generation to generation in powerful ways that are long lasting.
Thank you. See, Mark's hand is up.
What's the analogy? How can we compare these two things? Like, that seems to be one element that's missing, is the force of the federal institutions that do good things. Social media, this just seems.
Good points.
Don't be silly.
You are heard. Okay.
All right.
We will
How's
do
that?
our best.
I'll use my loud voice and my mic. I think the movement had phases, and in the beginning, it was about a focus to teach others exactly what it was like in the South. And yes, there was a philosophical issue, behind it, with Gandhi and the nonviolent and religious philosophies. But I think they knew if they fought back, then they would be blamed. And the whole point of being one of the points of being nonviolent was to really call attention to the oppressor. And the movement was very specific about who they selected. They selected Rosa Parks because she had a squeaky clean record. There would be no reason for anyone to push it back on her and blame her for what happened. And these marches were for the media to be able to film and to educate other people about the injustices that were taking place. And the movements that were less successful were the ones where the white governments, the people in power, did not attack the protesters, did not fight back, did not get the media attention. And then there's so many that you don't even know about, because the most successful protests were the ones with the Bull Connors, the people that were the abusers, and that called attention. But so there was that education piece, and I think a lot of people didn't know exactly what was going on, and it raised their awareness and they cared. Today, I think I struggle with the knowledge, because I think people know about the injustice and they don't care. And that's the harder thing to fight. So you can educate people and say, look at an election and look at some of the patterns that are being repeated for other terrible leaders in the past, and the injustices and the oppressions, et cetera. Look at it, it parallels, it lines up with this, warning, warning. Okay, but I think some people either A, don't care, or B, they are okay with the injustices. And I think the movement in the beginning was there were a lot of people in the North and in the South that really didn't know or didn't see that injustice. And once that was exposed, and I think they moved on to maybe another phase. But my struggle today is, how do you march on when you're dealing with a population that doesn't want to? They know about the injustices. They want that separation to continue to exist. How do you deal with that? Which John Lewis dealt with all of his life, and certainly things are different today than they were. But I think today we're faced with a group of people that don't care and are okay with the way things are, and believe that, you know, that separation is the way it should be, have been emboldened in that as well.
I'd like to respond to that. This, as a legislator in my second term, this has been my deepest frustration, and the thing that scares me the most is that in that chamber, I have found it very difficult to say anything myself, and I have hardly ever heard anybody else say anything about empathy or about trying to use the words we and us that still mean all of us. I mean, that's the essence of John Lewis's idea of beloved community, is we're all in this together. I mean, there's very specific language about that in the book, about we are all people, we are all human, we share this. And we really are entering this period where people don't care to consider the idea of we and us anymore. So that's the thing that scares me the most. On the other hand, I had a fascinating conversation just last week during a break-in session with Representative Bill Marsh, who you may know switched from the Republican to the Democratic Party last year because he's a retired physician, and he was just completely fed up with the New Hampshire GOP's approach to masking and to vaccines. And so he actually switched parties because of that. And I asked him, we were sitting out in the anteroom, and I asked him, how's it going for you now that you're here in the Democratic Party? He said, oh, it's so much easier. I don't have to bite my tongue all the time. And I said, are there other people in the party that you feel, in the Republican Party now, who are, you know, have things that they're thinking but not saying? And he said, oh yeah, absolutely, lots of them. And so it's not a monolithic body over there. There are a lot of people in the New Hampshire GOP, and by extension, I assume, in the Republican Party nationally, or in the conservative side of the ideological divide in our country right now, who are not 100% sort of the lost to the ideas of we and us, lost to the ideas of empathy. They're still thoughtful, they're still moderate in some ways, but they're not speaking. They're not speaking up, and that's the thing that just baffles and worries me, is where's the moderate conservative voice in the United States right now? Why can that voice not speak? Why can it not be heard? Why does it seem to have been made powerless? That's the thing that scares me the most, but it's still there. So I have hope that somehow the worst excesses that we're seeing on the right now will be moderated by people within their own party. That's my hope. I don't know how or when, but I haven't given up yet. I'm not lost to despair.
So that's a great lead-in to our next question, which is, do you trust John Meacham as an omniscient narrator? Were you surprised that Lewis selected a white man to be his biographer? Why do you think he did this? And how does Meacham frame Lewis's history and provide context to Lewis's recollections and stories? Did you enjoy how he tells Lewis's life story? good questions. I didn't write them down. They're not mine. They're somebody else's. I thought, my own feeling on this question was that I thought Meacham was selected by Lewis based upon his credentials. If you look at his wiki page and you just read his narrative as to what he's done in the past and how well respected he is as an author, it seems to be that he would be, regardless of his race, he would be a great person to write this narrative. He has experience looking at civil rights and publishing on that in a great way. So anybody want to comment on like how he told Lewis's life story and what your thoughts were on that one? I like the part of how he always like seemed to be, I don't want to say he was by himself, but when there were major events that happened in the book, like the JFK assassination, he seemed to retreat toward home and want to be on his own, looking at that, looking through those lenses. I thought that was interesting. Michael, you're up.
I thought one of the reasons that he chose Meacham was that Meacham is a Southerner. He's from Tennessee and would have understood perhaps better than somebody from New England, California, the Midwest, about what was actually taking place. Now, Meacham's young. He's only 50, so he wasn't part of the movement, but he's clearly an outstanding historian. And I think, as you said, I think he just chose him on merit. He's one of the finest biographers writing today, so it made a great deal of sense to choose him.
And now I obviously know I said his name wrong, so we'll go Meacham. Thank you. Anyone else on that one, that particular question? Yep, Alexis.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think that I have to think that John Lewis would have thought of the question of who would do his biography as kind of a political one as well, just because he was so politically savvy. And so I do think like making an intentional choice of somebody who's not partisan really would have been a really good decision for him, because it would get more readers, I think, and would have more opportunity for discussions like this, because it's not particularly partisan. It could be a biography, like a real biography of him. So that's my comment on that. And then I did have one sort of challenge with the author in, I don't know if I can find the exact page, but I just wanted a little bit more description of the Nation of Islam. And I sort of felt like there was a sentence or two, and it was almost like the phenomenon of black Muslims. And I was like, yes, like it's a little bigger of a phenomenon than one sentence. And even in relationship, I think, to John Lewis' biography, I just wanted a little more fuller of an explanation, especially given the quotes at the beginning of the chapter, more fuller explanation of that way of responding to the civil rights struggle. Yeah.
Another comment over here.
Along with the title, I think that the author was carefully chosen and politically chosen, that the book would get a wider reading with a white author. With a white author writing about a black person, and then it just, and his credentials as well. And I think, and it's my recollection that John Meacham used to write religious articles for Time, so there was probably that tie-in as well.
So when I go back to the beloved community issue as well with John Lewis and his thought process, and part of his thinking could have been that, a white author really represents what I have viewed in my vision for America as being a beloved community of all races integrated, and that therefore, I'm not saying he did it on purpose or anything like that, because I still think it was based on merit and the background of the author. But that could have been part of his thinking as well, as far as bringing him in as a reliable resource for that. Okay, so we're on to question 4, and it's what about John Lewis's history and the author's research on the civil rights and voting rights movements? What surprised you? What about John Lewis's history and the research on civil rights and voting rights movements surprised you? For example, were you surprised at how little reporting there was during this time, and what was recorded in newsprint was often inaccurate? Do you feel that this has changed? That's a loaded question. So was there anything that people read in the book that sort of surprised you about the voting rights and the civil rights piece, or was it pretty straightforward? And what about the reporting and how things were reported? I saw very little media coverage in the book, in terms of the televisions and the media of the time. It seemed like the New York Times and the mainstream media of the time sort of led the charge on everything that was being reported out. But again, that's not something I lived through, so I really couldn't comment any further than that, but that was something that was covered in the book.
One thing that surprised me was a personal issue. I was in junior high in 1960-61, and I remember distinctly in our civics class learning about the Berlin Wall being torn down, but I don't remember learning a lot about the civil rights movement. And I grew up in suburban D.C. in Maryland, and it just wasn't. Maybe it was there in the civics class and I just don't remember it. It was 60 years ago, but there were other things that people were talking about more, at least in my, civics class, than the civil rights movement, and that it was at the height of it, from the very beginning. That's what was going on.
So that's a question about the book then. The book seems to cover it in lighter tones, like I was saying, in terms of a couple of big mainstream media coverage of the day, but not necessarily in your face every day.
I was living in Hartford, Connecticut, in the early 60s when the voting rights move was very active. And I remember ministers from the local churches gathering together and going south to participate in helping with the voter registration. And then not long after, there were other students besides John Lewis who attempted to get into Southern colleges. And Charlene Hunter Galt was one of those, who then later became a CNN reporter and came to Hartford many years later to talk about her experience there. So my recollection is that there was some press coverage in the Hartford area following, because there was local participation in that. I felt worried and scared when we heard about the resistance and then the Emmett Till situation and so on that got a lot of publicity. What I worry about now is the attempts, including in New Hampshire, to really stifle talking about some of those issues very authentically as we look at divisive concepts and that kind of thing in education.
Thank you.
One other thing that I grew up in that, or was around in that era, a lot of, at that point, I couldn't afford the New York Times every day. We had a little local paper that didn't do too well, but Vietnam was coming on. And I had a very good friend of mine who was killed over there in about 62. And it wasn't really, he was not supposed to be there. I mean, according to the papers, we're not fully out. We were not fully engaged at that point. And that bothered me that he was sort of sneaked in with some Marines, and they were not able to pull out. So that Vietnam that issue was big at that time for me. knew of the civil rights, but the other part is that I had a family and a young job, and that all takes time too, to manage things away. So.
So it seems like, based on the feedback, that there was fair coverage of what was going on in the book.
I had a personal experience because a good friend of mine was dating a guy who actually went down to help register voters, and he knew some of the guys that got killed. So, you know, that was, yeah. So, and she ultimately became a lawyer and fought the case that Bill Baird took to the Supreme Court about abortion rights. So, activist community.
I think there's an interesting quote, and I think it shows the difference between the media today and the media of the 1960s. Howard K. Smith was an important correspondent during that period of time. And it says here, Smith would lose his job at CBS when he attempted to quote Edmund Burke, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of will is for good men to do nothing." At the conclusion of the documentary, anxious about alienating network's southern affiliates, CBS cut the quotation. I don't think that could happen today.
And there is a lot in the book about the political machinations around the issues. And it does a very good job of, I think, talking about things like LBJ and the Kennedys and the state of negotiations amongst the groups themselves, as far as when they were going to march, how they were going to march, the whole movement, and how it was going to take place, and what was happening. One of the things that I thought was amazing to me as somebody who's now 52 was looking at a guy like John Lewis, who was doing not the bulk of his work, because his breadth of work is extensive, but at such a young age, he had the attention of the Attorney General of the United States. He had the attention of the President of the United States. That's something that I can't relate to, and is really amazing when you think about not only his, other people as well, but their collective sort of influence around what was happening at the time. So it's a good point to bring up.
Can I add a bit about the education piece?
Yeah, yes, please do.
You didn't, it's not because you weren't paying attention. It wasn't in the books. It wasn't in the books when I was in junior high school in the 70s. It wasn't in the books. And it wasn't in the books when I started teaching in the 80s, other than the civil rights movement was a page or two, and there was Martin Luther King and there was Rosa Parks, and that was pretty much it. And then there was desegregation, you know, it was civil rights move on, because U.S. history from Civil War to present continues to grow. There's a lot of stuff to cover, and it just continues to get edited and edited more and more. There's been a big push, and I'm not talking about the 1619 project now. There has been a bigger push in the last 10 years to expand it, to expand history and make it more than just the few icons that we know about. I just lost my train of thought.
That's how it was when I was in high school, by the way. The
yeah.
60s and the 70s
Yeah.
got like this much in the history books,
Yeah.
and everything before that was like the rest of the book.
But if you remember when Roots came out, Roots was that big oh my, and that wasn't just an oh my for white people, that was an oh my for all people. That was really the first time that attention had been paid to African American history, and that African Americans were learning about their history, and that wasn't even civil rights. I've been to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, which is at the Lorraine Motel where Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I've been there 3 times, and it's so interesting to see that there are many black families who go to that museum during family reunions, and I know that because they have their reunion shirts on, so you know it's, you know, the Smith family reunion, and the older generations especially, it's as if they're learning it's our history, but what they uniquely connect to for the first time. And it's interesting to see that there has been such a lack of education across the board in this country, where even in the 60s and the 70s in textbooks, it was the happy slave. You know, there's been a lot to try to undo educationally, so.
Thank you.
Well, I can say as a previous children's librarian that when I first started and we started celebrating Black History Month, there were very few books for children other than something on Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, a couple of people. Now, finally, when it's Black History Month, we can bring out books about all kinds of people, all races, any race you want now. Finally, in children's services, you see every child can find a book that looks like them. But it's been a long time coming, and it's very frustrating. But I think when, in the 60s, children of color did not see themselves in mainstream children's books, and white children did not see them in their picture books. So it's a big difference now, and I think it helps everyone see that everyone is a person and they are important.
I wondered if anybody else sees this being now shrunk back, however, if you read the editorial in the Portsmouth paper, I believe, about a week ago by the Commissioner of Education in New Hampshire, and is wanting to focus and get out of the, I'll put it the other way around. I see it more as now controlling this, not letting this, the facts of this being allowed in the schools, or at least not getting pushed back. We have to be very careful what we teach in the schools. That's what he was saying on this topic.
I think, Bill, I share your concern because, you know, in Florida, for example, where they've ripped out math textbooks that have, to some people, objectionable or whatever, DeSantis. But so in trying to think of, you know, some hope in this, I think the surest, what I try, although I share all these concerns about, you know, ripping out academic freedom for teachers and for kids, but I think the surest way to get a 16-year-old to read a book is to say we're going to ban it. so.
Well said. Thanks, Mark. The next question from the book is, Meacham makes a point to include a wide variety of historic figures in telling Lewis's tale. What characters did you find especially memorable? Were there aspects about famous figures of the civil rights movement like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. that you have never heard of before? Did Meacham's descriptions change your perspective about any of these historic figures? And my lead off with that question is, I thought I knew LBJ. You know, I've read enough about him in the past, but the way he handled his politics was very interesting to me. You know, the sort of the down-home approach, but his compass was pointed in the right direction. He kind of always knew the right way to go, I think, in his heart, but the way he delivered through the politics of the time was, let's just say, it made for an interesting read. You know, because he was always thinking, like, counting votes in his head and trying to figure out, and that extended from all of the, you know, from the '64 Atlantic City Convention, which is discussed in the book at length, to not just that, but the Voting Rights Act, and sort of trying to get his arms around this movement. It was almost like both he and JFK knew of this movement, knew of its breadth, but had ways of handling it that were definitely symbolic of, I don't know, you know, I guess even as a town manager, I don't know enough about national level politics to know what happens in the back rooms, but it was just a very interesting read. So LBJ was my sort of pick out of that group.
In addition to that, I wrote down some notes. After Bloody Sunday on March 7th, 1965, LBJ persuaded the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, by saying, "What do you want left after you die?" I appreciated LBJ's candid, hard question. He didn't sugarcoat it with the governor, and it worked. You know, that one question, what do you want your legacy to be? That was powerful to me. But when we go back to the first part of the question, what characters did you find especially memorable? I found that the lesser known people were more memorable to me. Fannie Lou Hamer, on page 173, was told by her employer that she had to leave her work at home because she went to register to vote. How about the innocent children that marched with their parents? And they were beaten and they were killed as well. The innocent little girls who died in the explosion at the church. Those are the people that really stood out to me, the everyday people.
Anybody else pick out a character? I shouldn't say a character, a person from the book that they felt was significant? We've got somebody down here.
I thought that it was interesting that he brought in both Jackie Robinson and Stokely Carmichael. He covered the entire movement, and everybody was important that he identified in the book.
And that's impressive. He did it in 230 some odd pages, which isn't a lot.
Back to your question about were there aspects about famous figures of the civil rights movement like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. that you had never heard of before? Of course, there were some that I had never heard of before. There are some that weren't mentioned that I had heard of before. But I think New Hampshire knew what they were doing when they made Civil Rights Day rather than go along with the rest of the country with Martin Luther King Day. I was very frustrated and upset when it got changed to Martin Luther King Day because according to this book, and we all know that it was more than just one person, it was a lot of people that did this. And Civil Rights Day was probably celebrating all of them.
Thank you. There's disagreement on the floor. Uh-oh. All right, the microphone's out there.
Yeah, I have the mic. One name that I didn't know before reading this book was James Lawson. And apparently he was the one who really instructed the nuts and bolts of the nonviolent piece of it, which was the key to the whole, to the success of the civil rights movement, I think. And somewhere in the book, the point is made that, you know, the African Americans could not have won had they tried, you know, counter violence against the violence that was brought on them. They just didn't have the manpower and the authority and so on that the white people did at the time. So it was the nonviolent part of it that made the civil rights movement successful. And it was John Lawson, as I understand it from this, that actually sat down the students who were going to be, you know, doing the lunch counter sitting and the freedom bus riding, and taught them actually how to physically ward off blows and not to fight back, not to say anything back, just to take it, whatever it was. So I didn't know his name before reading this book, but I think he was a very key figure.
Yes, that's a really good point. He is mentioned exclusively, you know, many times over in the book as being a mentor and a guidelight to John Lewis. So there's another comment coming over here.
There we go. Yeah. I want to put a plug in for Fred Shuttlesworth. Because in 2010, I was able to take part in a National Endowment for the Humanities Landmark Workshop in Alabama for a week. and it was at the Birmingham Civil Rights Movement Museum, and Fred Shuttlesworth, who I'd never heard of before, was the Martin Luther King of Alabama. Like he was, and it was very eye-opening for me, because had I not started down that journey and taken that course, I would have been surprised about most of the people in here not having not heard of them. But that opened my eyes that every community, every state had to wage their own battle. It wasn't Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and once the bus boycott was successful, then everything became desegregated. Every community had to fight their fight in every front, and there were lots of foot soldiers, as I mentioned before, and many leaders that just went undiscussed beyond their communities. So Fred Shuttlesworth was the Martin Luther King of Alabama, and counseled people and worked tirelessly, and at times with Martin Luther King. But Martin Luther King would come and go. I mean, he wasn't just, the South isn't, it's individual states, so he was called to make appearances here and there and would leave, and they needed leaders to continue the fight, to march on in various places. And Fred Shuttlesworth, if you fly into Birmingham, the name of the airport is the Fred Shuttlesworth Airport, and it's after him. So that's
very good. Thank you.
I also have to be the grumpy one to say that we are 10 minutes over, so I just want to let people know that good times are happening.
Yeah, I was going to mention Diane Nash as well. So if if you're looking in the book at different people and that influenced John Lewis and had a great role to play in that movement, look up Diane. She's still alive. She's 83 years old and has a great background and was a major player in the freedom rides and other parts of that movement. So sixth question is, Meacham focuses much of his biography on the early civil rights movement and Lewis's teenage years. Why does he make this editorial choice? Does it show judgment on Lewis's later work as an adult leader of SNCC and as a political leader in the United States Congress? Anybody want to weigh in on that one? We're 10 minutes over, so if you don't, that's okay. I thought the book did a great job at capsulizing Lewis's main, well, he was influential his entire life, so I can't say that, but just his early years, I thought that it focused on his upbringing, did a good job of that, talked about the chickens, talked about, the chicken story, which is great if you haven't had a chance to read it. The chickens are great. And I think the author basically made that judgment as he wanted to fill us in on the man Lewis became, why he became who he became, and that was really the gist of that. So, anyone else want to comment on that one? Okay.
I thought it showed his integrity from a very young age and how he followed through that integrity. And I also noted that I think that can translate to young people today. Young people are strong, they have energy, and they have ideas for now and in the future. So I think it's good to, as teachers, as parents, as people within our town and government, it's important for us to teach them and to instill in them that they do have a voice and they can move along on their mission as well.
And the other thing too is it showed a lineage from his very young age to when he became involved in SNCC after, while he was in college and that sort of thing. He kept that creed through his entire life. And I think that's something to really respect, because there's not a lot of people you can point to that basically, okay, they experienced something at a very young age and it guided them and it cemented their worldview and they were able to hang on to that their entire life. I thought that was a very important part of the book.
This is just a tad off the topic, but I wanted to mention it for anyone who might be interested. someone who has been active in state politics, who used to be a state legislator, told me that they're having a protest on the bridge tomorrow against the Commissioner of Education and his stand for whatever his stand is.
Do we have time for the last question, Hope? Yes. Okay, so the last question I have is, it's a good one. What do you think John Lewis would think of the current political state of the United States, especially concerning voting rights? I think Mark led that charge earlier tonight by giving us a what for on that. Yeah. I think John Lewis, to me, the way the book lays it out, is he was an eternal optimist, and he was basically always trying to build bridges and follow that in his beloved community philosophy. And so even in our, I would say sort of in our darkest hour, I think he experienced what the darkest hour was in 1964, 1963, 1965. That was a really dark hour, maybe compared to what we're experiencing today. So I don't know if he'd be as positive and as enthusiastic today as in the face of what's going on with the Voting Rights Act and other things, but at least there's an optimism that comes through the book, I think, from his perspective of life and what can be accomplished. So that would be my editorial comment on that.
Could I share one hopeful story? This is actually from a young boy who was in Condra's book group with us. He was a 6th grader, so this book's a little above his reading level. So we read with him the book Ghost Boys, which takes you through all the little black boys in history who have been built upon Emmett Till's legacy. And he had a great quote that I love, which he is like, this book is kind of like a tree. It tells the truth, and everyone you talk to, you get another story. You kind of trim the tree, and you grow up with a tree that maybe has some lies in it, and you cut the limbs as you grow up and you read books, and you kind of get to figure out what the real truth is, like the core of the tree. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor for what we're doing here today, so I think it's wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. And thank you for indulging me as host. I appreciate it.
Thank you.